Hello and welcome to Mythmakers. Mythmakers is the podcast for fantasy fans and fantasy creatives brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. My name is Julia Golding. I'm an author, but I'm also director of the centre. And today I am joined by Victoria Goddard, who actually was invited on the podcast by special request of one of our listeners. So don't say we don't deliver. So if you've got any more ideas for guests, please do send them in, because for me, it's been an enormous pleasure over this week actually getting to understand and read Victoria's fantasy works. So first of all, hello to Victoria.
Hello, thanks for having me.
So Victoria, where are we talking to you? Where's your home base?
I live in Prince Edward Island, which is the smallest of the Canadian provinces. It's in eastern Canada in the Maritimes.
Fantastic. So should we have a little overview of the kind of things you write, so people understand where you sit in the fantasy pantheon, as it were? What kind of series do you write, and how would you describe them?
Well, I tend to tell people I write in the general kind of mythopoeic tradition from the Inklings onwards. So this was a nice fit with your podcast. I'm kind of one of those English-derived medievalists by background. My family's British, and first my dad was an immigrant actually, and always been very, very fond of them. I like writing kind of a vast, sprawling, interconnected narrative universe, exploring different elements of it. And I tend to like writing, I suppose, the stories that happen around the epics. What's going on after you've had the grand speech? How do you get from there to the actual work of living, and how do you do it? That's something I find really interesting.
So you recommended to me, as did the listener who wrote in, one of your books called The Hands of the Emperor, which I'd be absolutely thrilled to talk to you about in a moment. But you also, as you say, connected to this, you sort of dip into the history before and later, and you use your world building to go where you want. But you also have a series which is more like a duo, two connected characters, and that starts with the Stargazy Pie book. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. I enjoy writing a whole bunch of different kinds of books, and that's something I've always really liked, to connect to your kind of thing. Like, I've always liked that about, say, Tolkien, where you have such different books in the same universe as The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and so I've enjoyed that. Or somebody like Dorothy Sayers and her mysteries, where she writes different kinds of mysteries with the same characters, and so that's always appealed to me, that sort of stretching yourself as craft. And just being able to tell different sorts of stories and focus on different elements of them. And so the Green Wing and Dart series is sort of a bit of a more, yeah, it's a duo, kind of friendly, a little bit of a cozy mystery sort of underlying it there, and a bit of an adventure. And whereas The Hands of the Emperor is, it's about among many things, it's about a bureaucrat on the edge of retirement kind of thing. And so I suppose in terms of genre, I just kind of say, well, I'm right in the middle of fantasy, but I tend to write these sort of slightly off kilter towards genre conventions.
Yeah, and I think that's what is so wonderful about your writing, Victoria, is that you feel really original. That's There's nothing wrong with reading something which fits in a genre. So if you read a romance or a detective story, you know how it's going to turn out, or a Western. Yeah, you know before you start what's going to happen, more or less, but you don't know what the journey is. Whereas when I started reading Hands of the Emperor, I had no idea what the journey was going to be. And it was a pure delight. It's a longer book. It's not a sort of thing you can knock out in a day. But I have thoroughly enjoyed my week spent with your main character, Cleofa. So, but before we come to him, I'm just thinking about the influence and place on your stories, because the Green Wing and Dart series feels quite like a sort of 18th century feel. I mean, people are the sort of small villagey town type society there feels like that, whereas the world of the Hands of the Emperor is very much a much bigger scale. It's got a sense of almost a mixture of the sort of Chinese bureaucracy and the exams that you used to have to do to be part of the Chinese bureaucracy, but also island culture that could be from I don't know, Maori or Pacific Islands. I mean, you're creating your own world, but I felt that there was a sort of sample of different elements that you were going for. So, as a writer, have you travelled first and gone round squirreling away all these ideas, or is it something that you think, oh, I want to do this, and then go and have a look at it?
It's a little bit of both. As I said, my family's British, and I've spent a number of visits and quite some time visiting family members in various parts of England and Wales, particularly. And I did a year abroad in Scotland when I was in undergrad, and so for me, I've always really enjoyed that kind of, yes, the 19th century, sort of the Jane Austen, or late 18th, early 19th century, that kind of period of the early novels, um, and the sort of early Regency stuff, and then also just sort of the kind of idealized vision that people have of Oxford and Cambridge and things like that. And I enjoyed playing with that and thinking about. I have an academic background, and so I enjoyed thinking about, what the good parts of that and also the bad parts of that in some ways. We haven't seen that much of the university experience, but I enjoy thinking about it. And so for me, kind of travel, I once spent about 6 months walking down the length of England and staying with various relatives and friends along the way. And so that kind of sense of the landscape was a great resource for me. Otherwise, I've moved quite a lot around Canada growing up, lived in 14 places across the country. And my parents spent 10 years in Papua New Guinea, which is north of Australia. And so I had a lot of stories about Papua New Guinea and Australia growing up. And I think that really comes out strongly in The Hands of the Emperor with the
Yeah.
Wide Seas Islander culture, which is quite strongly based on sort of historic Polynesian culture, but there's quite a lot of Papua New Guinean elements in there too, from the Trobriand Islands and the Highlands, which is where my parents lived. And so I had lots of stories, and like the material culture of that my parents had various elements of it, and friends of theirs who come to visit us, or we visited them. I've only been there once, but that I remember. I was there when I was as a baby, but as an adult, I've only been there once. And so it was a very rich experience, even being a quite short trip. So I enjoy that combination. I feel like it's important to be very respectful of other cultures, and I try really hard to not to appropriate cultural elements, especially from ones that have been, historically colonized. But at the same time, I also think it's very important to try and broaden the base that you're building off of. So the Green Wing and Dart series is quite largely based off of kind of the English country tradition and country house stories too, right? Like that kind of the mysteries that you get out of, and that tradition there. But the Hands of the Emperor and the world that's set in, which is Zunith, I deliberately wanted it to be a non-Western European based society. I really wanted to get away from that. So the different parts of Zunith are drawn from different non-Western cultures as a conscious choice there.
And what the person who wrote in said is something along the lines of, I defy you not to fall in love with Clearfer. Now, Clearfer is the main character of The Hands of the Emperor. He is the Hands of the Emperor. You could describe him very boringly as bureaucrat, but actually he is just the most wonderful, wonderful character. I was saying to you just before we started recording that he reminds me very much of the Count Rostov, who is the lead figure in the fantastic novel Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towles, which is a historical novel, I think being filmed at the moment. But how that story works is that you just love spending time with that character. And I felt absolutely the same about Clearfer. And as you were just saying, what you're thinking about in this book are things which don't make it into fantasy. It's the stuff that's not around the battle. It's how do you hand on power? How do you retire? And there's also a really strong theme about what do the people back home think of those who have gone into another walk of life and got success elsewhere, which doesn't translate into the local context at all. They completely misunderstand him in sad ways. So when you started this book, did you start with the character and just see where it went, or did you already have those themes in mind and then, built him to fit the plot?
No, it was a very character-driven, different book. So my kind of general project, as I said, I write these sort of it's a sprawling, interconnected stories in my narrative universe here, and there's sort of two parallel core to that project. One of them, there's this empire called the Empire of Astandalaz, which has this catastrophic, cataclysmic, magical collapse that happens. And so it's sort of one of my projects is the lead up to that collapse and then what happens afterwards. I'm not really a dystopian kind of writer. I'm really much more interested in how do you rebuild, what happens afterwards. But that kind of shadow that falls across the entire cultures and individuals is something that I find very interesting to think about. And I think this connects back to something like Tolkien and the shadow of World War One that's always behind all those authors of the first half of the 20th century. And I've always found that interwar period quite interesting for that, with people not always talking directly about it, but it's always there. And so in my novels, that kind of the fall of Estandalaz is that culture wide devastation that people don't always talk about, but is always there. So that's one part of the project. And then the second part of the project is this figure of one character, and who is called Fitzroy Ingersoll, and he's a main character in various books and referred to in other ones. He's this poet. And so as part of that, one thing I was interested in with the fall of Estandalaz and the effects of it was the character of the last emperor of Estandalaz, who survives this destruction and ends up having to kind of rebuild on a personal level. And so I started off writing what was going to be a short vignette about the last emperor and what he was like in the period after things had sort of settled down after the fall. And I thought, oh, his secretary is probably a good window onto what he's like as a person. And so I started writing about his secretary, and it was really only intended to be a couple of scenes, or maybe one scene. Like that was all I was doing. And by the end of the scene, I had fallen in love with Cleophar as a character. He was just so interesting, and he just kind of kept going. And that was the story was an unusual one to write, because I usually have more of a sense of what the story is to start with, or at least like I often know what the emotional tone I want to end with is, or like the denouement. I don't always know what the climax is, but I usually know what the denouement is and where the characters end up. And so for that one, I had no sense of what the arc was at first. I just kind of but I kept being drawn to writing scenes, and I just kept imagining them, like I'd be driving or I'd be, taking the dogs for a walk or something, and the scene would come into mind, and I just have to go write it. And so for, I don't know, a year and a half, maybe 2 years, I just kind of kept going back to it and picking away at it. And I was enjoying writing it so much. Like I just loved spending time with Cleophar. And eventually I was like, okay, you know what? I'm not getting any other books done. I'm just going to focus on this one and see where it takes me. And eventually at that point, I realized that the reason I had so much problem seeing what the arc was because it was an incredibly long book. And so I'd written, 80,000 words, which is normally coming towards the end of a novel that I usually write. But that's really, I mean, not even a third of the way through this one. So the kind of character arc was just really getting going. And so, yeah, I just loved writing it. So the character really drove that story. I had a sense of what was going on with the emperor, and I knew at some point he was going to be leaving. There's some elements there, but Cleophar as a character just sort of shouldered his way into being sort of one of my favorites and a really important person in my stories.
I think it's a very good illustration of how it is that characters are the things that draw us to books, because the slice of one person's life through these momentous events is a really fascinating one to take, because he passes through the fall and the rebuilding. He's had his own personal journey, but which lots of people, you could have written the book about his journey home. He has his time in his life where he wants to go and find out what's happened to his family, but nobody's interested. So he only gets to tell it right later on in life. And that itself is a really fascinating sort of, it's dodging the most obvious, like it's not a quest in that standard sense. It's not a there and back again, except I suppose it is, but not in the sort of Tolkien-esque setting out to find a dragon way. And what I thought was fabulous about it was the way that you're really expanding a sort of, this is what fantasy can do, and finding a really original area to explore, the stuff between main events. Well, main events are happening, but the focus is on the experience of a man passing through those. So I can't recommend it enough, listeners. Go and you need a while. I think I would say that stick with it, because I couldn't understand it to start with. Well, why are we on holiday with this guy? Why have we started there? And you don't get it until you think, okay, and something really big happens where he takes a decision, and that has the consequences. Then, kind of like the first domino that goes down, and the rest of the book follows. So yeah, fantastic.
Well, thank you. I think for me with that book, one of the things I find it like that I just find endlessly fascinating too is one of the things about more traditional fantasy quest novels is particular is that the characters are generally um, without families. And for me, I feel like that question of you have a family that you love, but you have a desire to go traveling or to go and do other things, and they may or may not understand that is a very true one. We're not all orphans, with fates and whatnot. Like you can just want to have those adventures, and that's something I explore in different parts of my stories. Those kind of complicated families um, that are there, because I feel like I don't know, the people who love their families, and you can still have a complicated relationship no matter even if you love them and are loved by them very well. But it doesn't stop you from having those desires, but it makes them much more complicated. And I find that so like that's a thread through that story too. And kind of found families as well, and how that interacts with your biological family, friendship. Those are themes that I find really important too.
Yeah, I think the thing which I've taken away from it is a sense of love and fellowship between these palace servants who have given up a conventional life to serve the emperor and the emperor himself. Um, and it's they've been the person who dresses him, the person who guards him, that kind of thing, the person who writes his letters. And it's they've made this own little community, and a huge amount of humor in it as well, because you can get the perspective. Even though it's all from Cleophas' point of view, you do understand their perspective on him, because he's self-aware enough to know when they're sort of manipulating him into a yet more ridiculous outfit for some ceremony or something. Yeah, that's absolutely lovely. So you've answered the question as you're in this one, you were character led, but do you swap your um, technique depending on what sort of genre you've decided to write in your extended world? Would you, in another one, for example, plot it out more entirely?
To a certain degree, in general, I'm a character-led writer, and even with like the Stargazy Pie and the Green Wing and Dart books are more plot driven. But even there, I tend to kind of focus on the character more. I tend to be a writer I write into the dark, which is to say I'm an exploratory writer. As I said, I usually know kind of where I want the story to end, and I know how it fits into my overarching kind of uh, world building, but I leave a lot of it up to just figuring it out as I go along, and I find that very fun. I enjoy that process.
Do
Um,
you, do
yes,
you
I
have
would say
any?
I'm normally character led.
So do you? I mean, arguably the sort of very special thing about fantasy and science fiction is that you do your own world building. Though, of course, in historical fiction, you're also building a world in a sense. But anyway, it's clearly more of a world building task. Do you have any tips for people who are wanting to write their own fantasy? Um, how to organize or approach world building?
Well, I wouldn't say I'm very organized about it. People are forever asking me if I have maps and things like that, and I'm kind of like, well, no, I have sort of sketches that I've done on the back of a piece of an envelope kind of thing. I'm not very organized. I don't have a binder of all the useful measurements and stuff like that, which I probably could do with. It's one of those things I keep thinking I should go back and like make more notes for myself. I keep a lot of it in my head. But from that point of view, one thing I do find is, as I said, I try and draw from like less obvious sources. And for me, that's often I read a lot of sort of micro histories, I guess you could say, about specific things and try and build out from there. That's one element. So, you read a history of garden design or costumes or, I don't know, just looking at my bookshelves here, even something like, topiary or, the history of the teapots or something like that. And like they sound very silly, but and very, very, very precise. But at the same time, if you kind of think about, well, where did they come from? Who builds those? Give your characters slightly different things to do because that's more fun too. Like, like some, like, where's the cloth coming from? Where's the food coming from? Where's the water coming? How is it being cleaned or not cleaned? What effects does that have? Where's the waste going? I once once went to the sewer museum in Paris, and that has ever after made me question this thing about like where is the water purification system? How is that working? That could be working by magic. That's how it's working in Zuni. Then in other places it's not. It's much more traditional, like sort of refuse and rubbish, but that matters. So that's one element I do. And the other part that I find is if I've made a mistake or something that seemed like, if you're like, oh, in that book I said this, and in this book I said the other thing, and those seem to directly contradict each other. And, if it's a work in progress, the logical thing is to fix the one that's a work in progress. But I often find that if you stop and say to yourself, no, wait a moment, how can those both be true? What can I do to make those both work? Is that because person A misunderstood it, or person B understands it better, or there's something bigger that those are both kind of elements of, or like that kind of thing? I find that adds a real depth and nuance to the world, because like if I'm one of those people that I find if I do like um too much like front of brain world building, it becomes a little too smooth. And there's not like a lot of the nooks and crannies in it for me. Whereas I find if you do kind of the back end world building as you go and try and let it grow out logically out of kind of something unusual, that it becomes much richer. So for me, that's something I enjoy. And I try really hard to visualize places. I'm not always great at that. I'm better with gardens. That's a kind of a hobby of mine, is gardening. And so I really think about the like ecology of a place and what that might feel like, and look up that kind of stuff. So I guess for world building, if you make a mistake, it can be an opportunity to make it much richer.
Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting. I haven't heard anyone say it like that, actually. So how was your journey to publishing? What route have you taken?
Well, I decided I was going to do kind of the indie publishing side, largely because I wanted to write these interconnected stories and I wanted to be in control of what I was writing and when. And when I kind of really became serious about writing was when it was just after the kind of first flush of that, in the kind of 2012 was really when it kind of started to really pick up. And I had a friend who was much more aware of how self-publishing and indie publishing was going. And we'd spend a lot of time talking about it at that point. And I thought to myself, because I wasn't writing conventional stories, because I like these ones that are like around the corners of the epic quest and things like that, that I thought, that's really something I want to do. I don't want somebody to tell me that that's not like going to sell because it's not a conventional story, and which is a real concern, because of course there are businesses and they're trying to make money back as well. Whereas if I was willing to do it myself, I could, if I have something that nobody likes because it's a very strange book, then that's okay, that's mine. So for me, it was that. And I've just spent, I probably spent the last 6 or 7 years working on building up my works. And for me, what I did was I kind of decided to take the approach that my stories are interconnected and my style is fairly consistent. My voice, my authorial voice is fairly consistent across my books, even when they're in somewhat different genres. And I thought to myself, if somebody likes one of my books, they're largely going to like most of them or all of them. They're going to go and read the other ones. And so my general plan was basically to just keep writing them until I got to some sort of, hopefully, level where there were enough readers coming in that people would be, enjoying finding the others. And that's worked. I am going full-time writing this week. So I'm pretty pleased with that.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
So I basically just worked it up.
So how do you manage with the editing and all that kind of stuff? Have you got a team of beta readers behind you?
I'm a one reader kind of person. I like standing. I do have a couple people that other author friends particularly, and we kind of trade reading and talking about plots and kind of craft level things. And then I have somebody to do kind of copy editing of some form once we get to
Yeah,
that point. I do the layout and the cover design myself. So I've been
yeah,
working on that, and that's something I may well outsource in future, but I enjoy it and I enjoy the kind of that process of it too. So
yeah.
so for um, yeah, so that's how I do it, basically.
So, what next for you? Are you remaining in your extensive world? Are you, where are you going?
I am
You
remaining
said
in
you're
my
on your
extensive
little
world.
boat somewhere else.
Well, actually, I've been working on a sequel to The Hands of the Emperor for the last couple of years, and I'm kind of moving to focusing on that over the summer. So I'm hoping that will be out in probably late October, early November is the goal with that one. It's going to be another big honking book, so I'm not giving an exact date until it's a little closer to completion. It's more than halfway done right now, but you never know the kind of the final throws. Every once in a while, you write something and you realize the story's gone way off to a different direction that's much better, and you have to throw out a whole bunch of it in order to make that work. So that could still happen. And
Yeah.
so I'm working on that. The book I just had come out last week is called The Redoubtable Pally of Ramapool, which is kind of the second in a new series about the Red Company. And so I'll be working on that, and there should be another Green Wing and Dart later this year or beginning of next year as well. So keep on going with those ones. The Green Wing and Dart series is at 6, and I think there'll probably be 12 by the time that one's done. So just sort of poke along with those. I don't like writing the same character point of view back to back. I find it much better to switch to a new character. And so I tend to skip around a little bit like that.
We'll put a link to your website in the show notes so people can come and find all these books and decide which one they're going to start with. So, Stargazy pie, for the people who don't know, is actually a real dish that you would find, a traditional dish from, I think, Cornwall, in fact. And it's a pie where the pastry is laid so that the fish and head and tail poke out as though it's sort of breaking through from the crust. So in our podcast, we always end up with where in all the fantasy worlds is the best place for something. And I thought I would ask you for where in all the fantasy worlds that you've seen on television and films or read about in books, where do you think has the best sort of speciality dishes that you'd like to sample?
Well, surely we all want to eat the meal that Bilbo produces for the dwarves, right? I made
Yeah.
CD cake as a result of that particular encounter. That one's always been the one that those stories and some of the ones in the Narnia books too. To be honest, I've always loved the food descriptions in both of those books. Otherwise, I don't know. Like, I feel like in some ways those are really high points in terms of food descriptions. Um, it's like that meal that Shasta gets given in The Horse and His Boy. Um, is like that it's the first time he's ever had
Chocolate.
half of this
Mm,
stuff. And
yeah.
like, the description of the wine and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, and Bilbo's thing. And then I've also always, the picnic in The Wind in the Willows. Those are the classic kind of British ones. And I don't know. I'm not sure that there's been a lot more that kind of peak over those. But I was reflecting on this not long ago and thinking that I really needed to up my food descriptions. Something kind of work on that a little bit more. Really have some sort of great feasts that are like, but not necessarily like spectacular banquets, but just really delightful dishes.
Yeah, and it can be used for comic effect as well. For me, the one I was going to pick comes in the film Galaxy Quest. Have you ever seen that? It's one of my
Oh, yes.
favorite
Oh, that
films.
is a very funny one. The bit where they're giving them what are theoretically all their like their
Yeah,
regional specialties for the characters they are. That is such a funny
yeah.
movie. I really enjoy that.
So
I like just
just
humor in there.
for those of you who hadn't seen it, what happens there is an alien culture has taken a television sci-fi series as being historical. So when the characters are taken by this culture to try and help them solve a sort of baddie problem they've got, they've built everything for real. And this is all very well for the human characters who are given, I don't know, burgers and French fries or whatever. But poor old Alan Rickman, his character, Dr. Lazarus, is given this sort of soup tureen of live bugs,
Yeah.
which is sort of crawling out, and he's supposed to eat this because on the program that was supposed to be his food. It's just hilarious, and of course, nobody did sardonic better than Alan Rickman. Much missed. Yeah, so that's my pick. Victoria, thank you so much for joining us. And it's a delight to find somebody who has taken a lot of her inspirations from the Inkling writers and from, of course, we also mentioned briefly Dorothy L. Sayers, but you've said that she's another person that you've really enjoyed reading on your route to your own writing. So it's been wonderful to meet you, and thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much. I thank you for having me. I'm delighted you enjoyed The Hands of the Emperor, and I hope a few of your readers do as well. And yeah, the Inklings have been a huge part of my formation as a writer, and in many ways, I kind of keep reflecting back on them. Probably the Green Wing and Dart ones are a little more obvious, especially as you get later on into the series. You will see some much clearer kind of echoes of some of the C.S. Lewis and elements in particular, but overall, the questions that they raise and the joy they have in description and in food and in characters and world building is something that I've always really, really admired. So thank you. Really enjoyed getting the chance to talk to you about this.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.